Hello National 5 historians, welcome back to our next lesson in our Nazi Germany topic. Last lesson we were talking about this formation of the new republic and the provisional government, and about these groups who were trying to stop it. So in particular we're going to look at the first group within this, which is the Spartacists and their revolt in 1919. So pretty much what you need to be able to do after this lesson is describe who the Spartacists were and what actually happened during the revolt, and in particular we're thinking about the impact that this had. So what impact did the revolt, or the failure of the revolt, actually have on Germany? And we're thinking about long-term impact as well as short-term. So again, wherever you're taking your notes, wherever you're using them, write the heading, the Spartacist Revolt 1919, and move on to the next slide. So just a quick recap about what we mean by the armistice and what we've looked at in the last lessons. You don't have to write this, we're just going to go over it really quickly. So obviously by signing the armistice in November 1918, this new republic, this new government, provisional government, had been given some breathing space to decide what they were actually going to do and get themselves in a better position, so when negotiations on the peace treaty itself actually happened, they felt more in control. When the Kaiser had abdicated, there had never been kind of an election or anything like that in Germany before, so there hadn't been time to set up a voting system or anything. Ebert and the provisional government had to make these arrangements, which is why his government was provisional. It was only supposed to be in place until they had set up this voting system, and then the voting would take place, and then whoever won would obviously become the new government. So now they've got to organise and decide what to do next. A little bit of information about political parties, which is going to be important for later on. This is what the political party spectrum looks like in Germany between 1918 and 1919. So you've got left-wing parties, you've got the KPD, the SPD, the DDP, the Centre Party, and then more towards the right wing over here. So over the next slide I'm going to give you a wee bit more information about each one. It's probably a good idea if you put the heading and you make a copy of this diagram, and then use the next slide to just kind of fill in a wee bit of information about each one beside them. So we'll go over each one and you can just maybe put a couple of bullet points of information beside each of the headings. So the Communist Party, or the KPD, so you'd be writing this onto your diagram that you should have drawn in now, were also called the Spartacists. So that's the ones that we're looking at for this lesson. They were supported by the working classes, and what they wanted to do was use violence to attack and overthrow the government. So beside this one, what I might decide to do on my diagram is I would put just also called Spartacist, supported by working class, wanted to overthrow the government. So just key points from this about that particular party. The Social Democrats next then, or the SPD, they were supported by the working class as well, but they also had the trade unions on board. They wanted the government to make laws which would improve the working and living conditions for the working class. So again, key kind of point there, supported by working classes and trade unions, wanted laws which would improve working and living conditions for the working class. So just a wee bit of information for them. The next one we've got the DDP, or the German Democratic Party. They were mostly supported by the middle classes in society. They basically wanted the government to pass laws that just improved living and working conditions in general, mostly for middle class people, but just people in general. So wanted to pass laws to improve living and working conditions. The Centre Party next, so mainly Catholic party, did not want any great changes, so mostly Catholics that supported them. And our last one there, which you maybe want to rewind the video for a second, so you can get the last one, is the National People's Party, or the DNVP. These ones were supported by the rich landowners, the factory owners, the army officers, the judges, and generally the wealthy. Hated socialists and communists, so these two are not well liked, and was very much against the new government. So they pretty much just were against everything. Okay, so against the new government. The Social Democrats are what Ebert's party actually were. They were the ones in charge, so they were the ones that had kind of the majority of the say as the provisional government. So like we've already said, in the early years of Weimar Germany, there were many different attempts to overthrow the Republic and impose a new government, and this included the Spartacist Revolt that we're looking at today. This is where a communist far-left group who wanted to see this radical change in Germany decided to try and make the radical change happening. They were all for things like revolution, which had happened in 1917 in Russia. They were all about giving full power and control to the workers and the soldiers groups. They really very much wanted a kind of communist revolution to happen in Germany like had happened in Russia in 1917. So the new Chancellor that we've looked at, Friedrich Ebert, he was a member of the Social Democratic Party, like we've said, or the SDP. He believed that all of these parties should be represented in the Reichstag under this new government. And he was really opposed to this communist system of government. He wanted something that was more democratic, where everybody got a say, but he didn't want to be so far changing that it was just confusing for everybody, or much more confusing than it possibly was going to be. He was really worried that the communists would try and overthrow his government. So as a result, what he ended up doing was going to the head of the German army and making a secret deal with the head of the German army that if a revolution does start, or an overthrow attempt does start, that the army would support the new government. And in exchange for this, all of the army leaders would be allowed to keep their jobs in this new government system, so they wouldn't get rid of these generals. Neither Ebert or the army generals actually liked this idea or liked one another. Ebert had quite openly criticised the army's actions during the war. Görner, the man in charge of the army, was suspicious of the political party and its changes. However, they both had one united goal here, which was to stop a communist revolution from taking over Germany. They couldn't allow that to happen. So they agreed. In January 1919, 100,000 workers staged a demonstration in Berlin to complain about the poverty, the poor working conditions, and just generally the awful things that they faced. The Spartacists and other communist groups soon joined in, and it became quite a violent protest, with a lot of people becoming involved and a lot of damage being done. So we need to now know more about who the Spartacists actually were, what they wanted, how Ebert reacted, the actual event itself, what happened, and what the impact was. So to do this, we're going to make a mini fact file task. Now, you can do this any way you like. You can make it as a mini booklet, as a poster, a PowerPoint. You could do it as a leaflet. You could do it as notes in your jotter if you really want to. But the more interesting it is in your notes, the easier it's going to be to revise. So think about a way you can maybe make it stand up a little bit. You could do it as a pop-up thing, whatever is interesting for you. Decide how you're going to do it, and then when you're ready, come back at 9 minutes and 30 seconds and start the video from there to start your first section, which is who were the Spartacists and what did they ultimately want. So by now you should have decided how you're actually filling this in, and we're coming back to look at who were the Spartacists and what they actually wanted. So these are your first two sections of your fact file. Again, you're not writing everything, look for key points. So ultimately, Spartacists were named after the Roman slave and gladiator who had fought for freedom for the ordinary people, Spartacus, and they were led by two people, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who had set up a new party called the KPD, which we've looked at, the Communist Party of Germany. They had very different views from the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, who were obviously now in power. That's them there, and they believed that Germany should follow the footsteps of Russia and become a communist state. Very common thing at the time for a lot of communist people. So, key facts that we maybe need is that they were named after Roman slave and gladiator, Spartacus, led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, had very different views to the SPD, believed Germany should become a communist state. So key points. What they actually wanted, they thought Ebert, who was the new leader, and the SPD had not changed Germany enough, or their plans wouldn't change Germany enough. They wanted to overthrow Ebert's democratic government and replace it with communism. They wanted to give power to the Soviets, who are the workers, and share the wealth to basically create a completely equal society where people don't own anything, everything belongs to everybody else. They wanted to disarm the army, and they wanted to introduce welfare benefits for working class people. So for this one, they thought Ebert had not changed Germany enough, wanted to overthrow democratic government and replace with communism, wanted to give power to the Soviets, disarm the army, and introduce welfare benefits. Okay, so key points for the first two headings in your fact file there. Now, this one's a bit bigger. How did Ebert react to this? So he publicly stated that the Reichstag was there to protect the people, not to control them. He issued propaganda posters showing that Spartacists were violent terrorists. Remember, what do we call this? Okay, propaganda being used against them. He made secret agreements, we've already said, with the German army to protect them. The army, however, weren't as powerful as they once were, so they had to rely on another group. They had to rely on a group called the Freikorps. Basically a volunteer army of ex-soldiers that had supported the Kaiser and were very anti-communist, very violent, very aggressive, but completely anti-communist in every way. So how he reacted, he publicly stated that the Reichstag was there to protect the people, not control them. Issued propaganda posters showing the Spartacists as violent terrorists. Made a secret agreement with the head of the German army. And called upon the Freikorps to help stop any arguments or any violent actions. So the revolution itself. 5th of January 1918, 50,000 workers went on strike and demonstrated in the centre of Berlin. The demonstration was taken over by the Spartacist leadership. They seized public buildings, newspaper offices, built barricades, shouted their favourite slogans, which is things like "damn, damn, damn" with the government, but they had no organised plan for an armed revolution. They were ready, they had the people, they had the means, and they had quite a lot of really good and willing people ready to fight for this, but they had no plan. A lot of the workers were waiting as the leaders got together and tried to discuss in the public building that they had seized what they were going to do, what they had planned for the revolution and how they were going to do it, and the workers just waited outside. It became cold, it became wet, and eventually they became tired and they went home. The Freikorps then turned up with weapons such as tanks, guns and grenades that the army had provided them, and they put down the rising with violence. No mercy was shown by the Freikorps, who were very much against these communist people who were causing the violence apparently, and within a week the killing was ultimately over. So the 15th of January, 156 people had been killed and hundreds more had been wounded, and it became known as Bloody Week. So I'm not going to highlight this one. I want you just to kind of look for your key points yourself and write down the events of the revolution. If we think back to Rise of Evil, this is what we can kind of see happening when the character of Hitler actually comes back to Germany. You can see that happening as he takes the job from the police, and you see the Freikorps actually fighting back against these people. They had the opportunity to take over after they seized the public buildings and all these areas, but because they didn't have a plan in place, nothing really came for it, and the Freikorps were very ruthless at dealing with their opposition. Ultimately, what happened to the leaders? So the government put out the price of 100,000 German marks on the heads of the leaders. Karl Lieberknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were both arrested. Lieberknecht was later shot while trying to escape. Luxemburg's body, after being brutally assaulted, was then dumped in a canal and was very much, again, she was trying to escape and she was then assaulted as a result of that. Almost 700 men and women of communist supporters were arrested or shot, and ultimately the Spartacist Revolution's leaders came to failure. There's a really good YouTube link up here that I'll put the link to in the playlist for this. You can check it out, which gives you more information about what ultimately happened to the leaders, so you can watch that and again add the information to your fact file. So the impact of the Spartacist Revolution. Basically, the Weimar Republic got off to a bloody start. It was not the start anybody wanted. They definitely should have obviously tried their best to do this politically, but it was the only option available for them, and they got off to this start. The government was seen as weak because it had relied on the ex-army. Ebert was making secret alliances, which meant he could not be trusted, and the communists would never trust the SPD again. Now, this is going to be important later on, because when Hitler and the Nazi Party actually do manage to take over the Reichstag, had the KPD, there was a point where if the KPD and the SPD had joined forces together, they would have been able to gain a majority over the Nazi Party. But because of this point, they would never trust one another again, even to the extent that when it came to that, they wouldn't do anything. So this meant that the left wing would never be strong enough or united enough to take on the right wing. So there's never going to be an effective opposition later on when Hitler and the Nazis try to take over. So again, pause the video and fill in your information for this bit in your fact file, and then come back at 18 minutes and 45 seconds for the next section. So ultimately, what now? After the defeat of the Spartacists, the elections were held for a National Assembly. The main job of this was to decide what sort of government Germany should have, rather than just trying to uprise and seize power. They decided to meet in the country town of Weimar, which was very far away from Berlin. Berlin is up here and Weimar is down here in the star, and away from the danger and the violence that was happening with the Spartacists trying to storm the buildings where these meetings were supposed to be taking place. By the summer of 1919, it had drawn a new constitution, a new set of rules that the government of Germany was going to go by, and as a result, the Weimar Republic was ultimately born. Okay, so finish off your fact file. Tasks for this lesson is to finish your fact file and to complete these 3 questions and upload the 3 questions in the team. If you have anything you're not sure about or anything that you want to ask, definitely check with your teacher, put a message in the team or send an email.